Okay, this next segment goes for 7 hours, and we will... Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's not right. Okay, I want to move from this overhead using highly scientific methods and go to that one and get back to where I was when we flipped off. There we go. Look at that. Just like regular people. All right. You've got a handout, so I'm not going to go through all these, but I just would like to encourage you that these are resources that I just think are useful, and so we put them together for the symposium to suggest that there's a lot of different things that have been written, and I've tried to indicate with a little bit of annotation which ones are especially scholarly, which ones are very good and easy to get into, and so on, and there's quite a list. And then I want to get on to some comments about reliability of Scripture that I think are of some value. And, you know, sometimes I do these one by one, but I often like to just put them all up there and you can see where I'm headed with my comments. Bible textual confirmation is unprecedented. There's nothing like it because of the sheer, unprecedented, unequaled number of manuscripts confirming the material. What's also interesting, and I just make this because, you know, we deal with, in this world, the two most popular religions, Christianity and then the second most popular, Islam. There are more people that hold to Christian faith than any other, but Islam is second, and a very strong and strident second. And one of the interesting things about Islam is the belief that if you translate the Quran, it really ceases to be holy. It depends on which branch and which individual will tell you whether it's something worthy of your being put to death or not. That isn't necessarily how far it goes. But there really is this concept that it can't be done. And as a result, as you may know, all around the world, if you really are a true Muslim, then you're going to pray in Arabic. It's as if, and there actually are some Muslims who have argued this, God speaks Arabic. It is the language of heaven, and therefore that's what you must pray in. So there are a lot of people in the world praying Arabic prayers, the meaning of which they don't really understand. They're taken from some of the surah of the Quran, some of the chapters of the Quran, and that's what they pray. So at least when we think about the differences between Christianity and Islam, we should think about that factor. It's one of many, many differences, but it's worthy of thinking about. The difference in terms of where you focus on something in a single language and say that's it. Whereas the Bible, even in the Old Testament already, was being translated into other languages, so parts of the book of Ezra and parts of the book of Daniel, as well as part of Jeremiah and even part of Genesis, are in Aramaic. You have several Old Testament books, partly in Aramaic along with the Hebrew, and then also the translation early on into Greek, which then becomes the lingua franca, and therefore is the language of the New Testament's composition. And that is just a way of getting into the third point, that there's a vast range of times and providences for Scripture. This makes it interesting. It's not something that God dictated to an individual, but rather over this vast range of time, what we would call different cultures. Now, you can say there's a kind of a human culture that unites us in a way in times and places, but there are certainly many individual cultures. And when you think about the fact that the Bible bridges the European and the Eastern and the African, and is from all those continents, and over a period of time that at a minimum is 1,500 years, but can be considerably longer, appreciate that. Appreciate that level of variety, those range of provenances or origin locations, and then also ask the question, can we trust what we're getting? Has the Bible been tampered with? And you know, many people have read about the Dead Sea Scrolls and may not know much about them, but they know there's something important there. And there's all kinds of different things in the Dead Sea Scrolls and documents of various kinds. But the basic thing that the Dead Sea Scrolls are is ancient copies of books of the Old Testament. That's the main thing it is. Lots and lots of copies. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are written from about 250 BC or so to about 70 AD. So there's about a 300-year period that these scrolls seem to cover. And again and again and again, the main use is just to ask the question, going way back from the manuscripts we used to have to deal with, which were post-Jesus, they were AD manuscripts, to BC time period, what have we got in the text? And it's amazing the degree of confirmation. One of the things I teach is a subject called text criticism. It is a fancy name for trying to do analysis of all these manuscripts in all different languages. My poor students actually have to analyze passages looking at not only the Hebrew, not only the English they happen to like a lot, but the Aramaic and the Greek and the Syriac and as well the Latin. These poor students have to try to figure that out. Those languages are the basic ones for looking at them. And even with all those language translation issues and so on, what you find is what's in the final point, scholarly commitment to text reliability. I would say to you, and I've written some articles on text criticism and the Bible and so on, and had to deal with this issue at great length and studied it and worked with it all the time. I would say to you, just this is personal experience, and that doesn't make it right. The argument from authority is often flimsy, as you know. So I'm just saying my own experience for a lifetime of doing this is that it's too much for a conspiracy. There's no way this could have been a forgery, a fake, a small group of people putting something together and then making sure by paying the Knights Templar well that it never really got out, and so on. All of that stuff is nice fiction, but it sure isn't fact. The Bible we've got is a documented, protected, covered, many copied, many witnessed book in a way that's too many and too long for it ever to be a conspiracy. And you know, since people are into conspiracy theories, my guess is many of you have dealt with questions from people who say, oh, isn't the Bible a fabrication? Wasn't that all done by somebody in Rome a few hundred years ago and foisted upon the world and so on? They don't know anything, and it's what they've heard, and it sounds like a good rumor. The kind of rumor we want to embrace. Makes sense to me. That's really refutable very easily, and the kind of thing you might just spend some time learning in order to figure it out. Now, a few more general points. We are constantly increasing our data and our methodology. Finds like the ones I've shown you are constantly coming in, but there are bigger finds. There are still Dead Sea Scrolls being read. There are still documents and copies from mummy masks and from garbage dumps that are picking up information for us. And the point that's down there, number 4, more funding. A certain gentleman named David Green, who owns the Hobby Lobby stores, I don't know if they're around here, but they're in a few places in the country, and who is a very wealthy individual. He and his family have committed, I wrote 50 million, that's wrong, it's 500 million. Sorry, just allow me to correct this. We escape, we go here, we add a 0, whoop, a 0, we go back to the display, and we go down the list, and there we have it. As you know, $500 million has been committed. No, seriously, this is far and away the biggest financial support for manuscript collection in all of history. Usually, you know, it's been this synagogue here had 1 copy, and that library was able to get one, and then this collector got one, and so on. But what the Greens have said is, with all this evidence, with all of these proofs, with all of this data, with all of the stuff that can be put together, and manuscripts that are supportive thereof. It isn't always just biblical manuscripts, but documents from the church fathers, letters about Bible texts, and so on. Let's collect it. And there is going to be a museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. The Green family and others are planning this. They have acquired land on the mall, which I don't have the money to do that. My wife and I definitely could not buy land next to the mall in D.C., but they've acquired it, and they're going to have a museum of the Bible. But their purpose is not just to have a museum. Their purpose is to have a centerpiece for collection. One of the interesting things is the bottom point. A lot of this work's being done at Oxford, but the Green family happened to be very friendly to the seminary I teach at. And so they've given to us a wonderful kind of carte blanche. Any of us can request manuscripts in the Green collection as they're buying them up from all over the place in order to preserve them and protect them and so on, to work on. And you'd be surprised at the number of things that have never been worked on. Part of it is you have to have expertise. And as you know, to have expertise in certain areas takes a lot of time. And most people can't do it unless they have a job, and the number of jobs for people who can teach Coptic is not huge. Chances are in your parish you don't have a Coptic priest. You have a regular American one. So that's all part of the challenge, but it's wonderful what can happen. Some of you may know that there are newer ways of dating manuscripts now. There's carbon-14 dating, but there are also mass spectrometer ways of speeding up that process and doing many manuscripts in a short amount of time. And it enables us to do much, much, much better dating than could once be done. And there are many other things I could talk about that would be probably too technical for us to enjoy in terms of just preservation, accuracy, and so on. And I would say to you, there's a kind of a bottom line to this. And that is what once used to happen, which was saying, oh, those texts disagree. And there are texts that disagree, that's certainly true. Or there's no way to know what the original said because over here this word is used and over there that word is used, and therefore. Now, the science of text criticism really has been coming together. A lot of it put on a high-speed track by the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery. That's decades ago, but it's been maturing and having its power. That has been happening in a way that really does make a difference for us. And so this is an interest of mine. It's only one thing, text criticism, text analysis, text proof. It's only one part of a big picture. And you and I know perfectly well, we might convince people that the copies of the Bible really are reflecting what was originally written down by one of the apostles or by one of the prophets or by Moses or whatever. We might be able to convince somebody of that, but they're still going to ask the question, so what? Does this make me a believer? But at least they don't have to get hung up nearly as much anymore on the question, are the materials themselves real reflections of the original? And that's a nice thing. So that to me is for you a kind of a progress report. I'm giving you what I would call a progress report. It's coming together, and it's coming together right now in our lifetimes in a way that it couldn't easily have come together before, and an awful lot is being learned that undergirds the accuracy of at least the wording in the text. Now, a couple of comments on critical theories. This may be really boring to some of you, but for some of you it might just help. And I'm going to spend about 3 or 4 minutes going rapidly through this particular amount of data on the slide. Many people, when they went to seminary, many of you, heard about something called the documentary hypothesis, a theory based on the assumption, it starts out with an assumption, the Bible's a human book, and asks the question, if the Bible's a human book, therefore Moses could never have written all those things found in the first 5 books, the Pentateuch. So how would it have come about? And they theorize that there's certain groups of authors and traditions, and they give them names, and so on. And some of the scholars who were involved in that, starting with Hobbes, you may, I don't know how recently you've read Hobbes's book Leviathan, But in that, he actually questions Mosaic authorship, and he's one of the first people in history to do that in that book. That's now 4 centuries ago, and it got sort of reached a kind of an apical point in the work of a guy named Julius Wellhausen in 1877. The foundation of it was very simple. Interestingly enough, you might find this funny, but here's the foundation. Wellhausen, and going all the way back to Hobbes, noticed the prophets never quote the law. Now, if the law existed, why don't they quote it? If you have this law from way back in the days of Moses, and the prophets are dealing with people breaking the law all the time, as they are, all the prophets deal with that, law breaking, disobedience to God's covenant. Why don't they say, as Moses wrote, comma, and cite one of the commandments or something? Why don't they do that? And this was considered a bedrock, obvious fact, until a couple of scholars named Driver and Miles wrote a book almost 100 years now that didn't have its impact all that instantly. You know, it's an amazing thing how much that's true. Lots and lots of things take decades to filter their way into the consciousness of scholars. I can notice that even with things I've done. When I published an article, I begin to see people refer to it 20 years later. It's very interesting. It starts to show up in the books and so on. And I say, oh, finally, well, that's where this person bought it at least. It's really amazing to do that if you are a contributor in the scholarly stream of information. But the problem is, nobody quotes anything in the ancient world. You know, quotation doesn't exist really in the ancient world. Not what we would call literary quotation or literary citation. And Driver and Miles, who wrote on the Babylonian laws, pointed this out. Now, I did a year when I was at Yale just studying Babylonian legal texts. We were reading through court cases, Babylonian court cases from around 1700 BC. You know, if you have any problem with insomnia, I have the answer. Read Babylonian court cases from 1700 BC. I don't care what your problem is. You'll be out in 5 minutes. Dead to the world. The book will be there over your face or on your chest. You'll be gone. But anyway, there you have, Hammurabi's code was less than 100 years old and everybody knew it, and yet court case after court case after court case is decided without ever a citation. Now you can tell they're thinking about it. You can tell that it's completely in agreement. The parallels are there. Even sometimes the language is kind of reflective, but there's no citation. Legal citation didn't develop until the Roman era. And you see in the New Testament, this is underway. Sometimes in the New Testament, it will simply say, in another place it says. That's all it says. Because they're just starting to cite. Other times they'll say, as the prophet Isaiah says. Sometimes it's very general, as the prophet says. Sometimes they combine 2 prophets into one citation, which is, you know, efficient. That can happen as well. So remember that the undergirding of the notion that the Pentateuch had to be a very late fictional thing written by human authors comes in great measure from the notion that the prophets don't quote the law, and when you realize that couldn't have happened, never happened anywhere in the ancient world, even when we know there's a law and court cases based on it, they never cite it. That's a very important thing. Now, I know that's one little detail in a big picture, but some of you probably in your training or in your reading, whether you went to seminary or not, may have heard that. And it's a most interesting fact that gradually we've become to realize this. And so even my pals at Harvard, and actually it's an interesting thing, several of the people who now teach it at Harvard are people I went to school with. So we were students together, and so they're still good friends. But they are now rethinking the old, quote, documentary hypothesis. And I think that's going on pretty much everywhere. Furthermore, it's important to appreciate the fact that vocabulary varies with the material. a lot of the documentary hypothesis, again, if you don't know this, just believe me, it's a thing that is often taught to students that gets them thinking of the Bible as a human book when it actually is an inaccurate approach. A lot of it is also based on vocabulary variation, but vocabulary variation varies with the material. That's something that's now pretty much proved. Vocabulary is a function of genre, as the bottom statement makes. Now, a little bit more about critical theories in the Bible. So in a way, I'm coming at things from a backward point of view, saying, well, here's what we're not buying into as we think about Scripture today, but it is what many people have bought into, so I think it's relevant to spend at least a little touch of time on it as we're doing now. Wellhausen's starting point was also, in the most specific way, the 22nd chapter of 2 Kings, where we have reference to the finding of a copy of the Bible during the days of King Josiah, 622 BC. A king named Josiah, and a copy of the Bible is found. And Wellhausen says, that's it, that's the fabrication point. Somebody wrote this up, brought it in and said, hey, we found a copy of the Bible, O king, and it was really just some prophets made it up, and of course we're going to try to influence the king to go in their direction with their particular theology. But interestingly, it turns out that more and more we understand something called foundation deposits, and we realize that in every temple in the ancient world that we know of, including Solomon's temple, that temple where that find was made, described in 2 Kings 22, there are copies of the most important key seminal or foundational books or documents placed. In other words, if you and I were to build a temple of some kind to the god Furbeldorf, I think that's kind of a nice name now that I made it up, the god Furbeldorf, we would put in our documents about Furbeldorf and whatever books we might have, and if there are prophets among us who claim they've listened to Furbeldorf and they have some things to say, we might write those down and put them in. But we would not start to use that temple until we had created these foundation documents and actually put them into chambers in the bottom layer of our temple. That was done in every temple we know of. And as scholars, it's been in the last 50 or 60 years that they've been studying more and more foundation documents, begin to realize this was standard procedure. So it makes perfect sense that a copy of the Bible would be found. And what Josiah is doing is not saying, oh, wow, I've never heard of the Bible. Wow, this is great. Rather, the Bible of his time, which would be either the book of Deuteronomy or the Pentateuch or something. That can be debated. But instead, what Josiah is saying, oh, an old copy from the very days of King Solomon. I want to hear it. And that produces the revival that's described in 2 Kings 22 and 23. Moreover, there's the problem of the language of the Pentateuch. These are foundations for critical theories of the Bible. It's assumed to be a late language. There are a number of things about this. First, we know more and more about the way that things are spelled, and there's a lot of spelling traces. If you read the Hebrew and you know what you're looking for, traces of the spelling indicate real old material, surviving from a very old time. Why would people today write like Chaucer? Well, the answer is they can't write at all, but no, the answer is the answer is they wouldn't. You don't spell like Chaucer spelled. Yeah, you spell like you spell now. So the history of spelling is a way to date things, and that's better and better understood. And that history of spelling wasn't even really thought about until the 1950s, and it has become a science. It's called paleography and paleorthography. The discovery of the Ugaritic language, a language spoken in ancient Syria, gives us a feel for huge amounts of things. That died out, that language, in a conquest of that part of the world in 1215 BC. So we know that all Ugaritic is from earlier than 1215 BC. That, in other words, from the time of Moses, back into that time period, and suddenly all kinds of things connect. So you see the language. Other Northwest Semitic documentation. And for that matter, an interesting thing is that we have in the Bible what a lot of skeptics have thought would be a Persian period document. The Persians controlled the ancient Near East from about 540 BC to 333 BC when Alexander the Great took it over. But for those 2 centuries, the Persians ran the show in what we call the Holy Land, and even Africa, and certainly all of Asia and Asia Minor and all that, and even parts of Europe. And do you know that there are lots of Persianisms in the Hebrew of books written during the Persian period? So you can find Persian loanwords and Persian features, just little places here and there in the book of Esther, because that's from the Persian period. So obviously, that's all about Esther and the Persians. And you can find that in Ezra and Nehemiah, lots of Persianisms in Ezra and Nehemiah, because they are from that same time period. Now, an awful lot of scholars say, well, so is what purports to be, but is obviously fictional, that 5-book chunk that we call the Pentateuch, the books of Moses. But do you know there's not a single Persianism in the Pentateuch? It's just not there. None. Zero. Zip zilch. It's very interesting. If Persianisms can be seen, analyzed, identified, and so on in other books that are from the Persian period, and the Pentateuch is supposed to be from the Persian period. So there, I mean, I tell you, the literature right now being published, people are saying, hey, that's right, no Persianisms, what do we do now? It's very interesting. Another kind of critical feature was vocabulary variety. If you have people using one word for a household female servant, there is a word for that, alma, and then there's amma, and then there's another word for a female household servant, shifcha. Well, which one will we use? What is the word we're going to use? And the answer is vocabulary diversity is now documented from all these other finds. The more the finds come in, the more we see the vocabulary diversity. You see it all over the place. So pretty soon you begin to say, wait a minute, vocabulary variety cannot be used to indicate different sources. You can still have one person compose the Pentateuch. You can still have it be really a guy named Moses who wrote this all up, who had the credentials and the training and the education and the competence to do it, and could produce for the people of Israel as they were entering the Promised Land a foundational background story for them and, fortunately, for us, since we've still got it. Another problem that was supposedly a threat to the idea of scriptural accuracy is parallel accounts was just parallel accounts. In other words, you know, there's a story of Abraham lying about Sarah in Genesis 12. Then there's a story of Abraham lying about Sarah years later in Genesis 20. And then there's a story about Isaac lying about Rebekah because he certainly learned well from his dad. So you have 3 stories, and many scholars say, oh, come on. Now look, common sense tells us these are all the same story, just embellished by different authors and told in different tribal settings, and then eventually put together in the Bible. And so they make it look like it's 3 different occasions, but there are too many similarities. It's got to be one occasion. And that's, you know, it's a way of theorizing. People do that with literature. You know perfectly well there are people who say Shakespeare couldn't have written Shakespeare. How could this country kid ever be so smart to do that? So obviously it had to be written by this person or that, or the Count of Monte Cristo or somebody. They come up with various theories. So, but interestingly, you get the same kinds of things in ancient annals. You actually get from the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Hittites and so on, the same kind of thing. And the more people study these things, I know it takes years to get the competence. You've got to get up to the doctoral level and beyond to get the competence to analyze things. They begin to say, wow, look, we know one person wrote this for the king, wrote a history that year of what the Babylonians did around the world, an annal, a yearly report kind of thing. In a Baptist church, those are written to be never read again. That's their purpose. We will now write something up, include it in our annual report with confidence that it will never, ever see the light of day. It's a thrilling thing to think, no one will read this. This is now secret forever because it's in our annual report. Anyway, it turns out those annual reports have the same kind of vocab differences, same kind of parallel accounts and so on, and yet we know they're unified. They were written in a single year, and sometimes the name of the scribe is provided. So you know perfectly well it's not that. A foundation for critical theories of the Bible was that you can determine sources and texts by certain methods. The problem is you can't replicate. It just doesn't replicate. It's like those studies showing that the thinner you are, the longer you live. The trouble is, it doesn't work. And there's lots of evidence that shows, no, it doesn't work that way. Or, you know how you read about the latest miracle drug, licking kale or something will add 40 years to your life, and everybody does it for a while. And then then somebody publishes a study saying, sorry, that doesn't work. And by that time, you're on to standing on asparagus in the shower, or whatever it is. Anyway, so a couple more of these, and I thank you for your indulgence because some of this may not excite you too much, but I'm reviewing some of what has come along in years that where skepticism has come about, and where there really is an answer, a problem for the skepticism is what I mean by problem. So, foundation, literary criticism theories. The one trouble with that is oral translation studies, tradition studies. We know that in the ancient world where people did not read much, even when they could read, so expensive to read and write, the writing material's not very complicated and expensive, they would commit things to memory. And the more you understand that, and there's modern studies done in plenty of places around the world where this still is the practical fact. It turns out that people can remember very large amounts of material, and you don't have to say, as was once theorized, that everything was originally circulated in little atomistic sections that were later put together by anonymous editors. Because that's a standard theory, and some of you may have been taught that. Boy, there's a lot to undermine that now. There's also a great consensus about the documentary hypothesis that was actually somewhat blown up by a book by a very, very competent British scholar, R.N. Whybray, that published in 1987. And Whybray actually says, look, consider this theory and what's got going for it. Consider that, consider other options. And he actually said the documentary hypothesis is far less likely to be true, and he did it in a very brilliant set of arguments, I think, than either the supplementary or the fragmentary, which are two other kinds, in which basically the result of his book was to cause a lot of scholars to say what I will now skip to, and I'm going to skip enough to do that. Here's a conclusion by a current scholar named Sommer. He says, the verities enshrined, I love that, isn't that great? Enshrined in older introductions. That means theories about the Bible and how they came to be and how it was a bunch of humans putting things together in primitive ways and eventually getting grouped and more sophisticated and rewritten. Those theories have disappeared. Now that's quite a thing for a guy to say. This is a very serious comment. What many of you were forced to learn in seminary has disappeared. I want you to know that. For the good, I think, but still it has happened. In their place, scholars are confronted by competing theories. That's very true, because a great many people are committed to the fact the Bible is obviously only a human book. That's their starting point. So they got a lot of different theories about how it could come about, but these theories then are discouragingly numerous, and they are. It's all over the place now. It's like noodle soup out there. Exceedingly complex, couched in expository style that is, quote, not for the faint-hearted. It can be tough to wade through. So if you're actually following what's going on in the last few decades, and I think especially since Whybray's book in '87 caught a lot of people's attention, it's now much more up for grabs. That has problems because the seminary student nowadays, the person opening a book about the Bible, might be getting somebody's latest, newest theory that's really off the wall and wild, but being presented as if it's the answer. And yet totally different theories are out there as well. But I think part of what happens is from all these directions come these doubts. They are basically skepticisms housed in various scholarly clothing. But from all these directions they come, and the directions don't agree. So at least you have to say, those who are skeptical of the basic reliability, trustworthiness, accuracy, dependability of the Bible are not able to agree on why, how, what. They're coming at it from entirely different points of view. I say that chaos is something we have to face and be aware of, but it should not daunt us. We should be able to say, in that situation, since there is this chaos, those of us who think it really is a special book and that God's behind all of it have an absolute right to proclaim that, teach it, show the evidence for it, and take it seriously. I don't see why we can't do that. There's no consensus out there that says, oh, cut it out. There really isn't anymore. And that's quite significant. So I have written translation chaos. That's just a little thing. Now, I'd like to talk about some consequences. These are very practical things. They don't make it right or wrong. That's not the point. But you know, there is an almost total correlation between skepticism about the Bible and the strength of churches, of denominations, of seminaries. Now, I think most of you probably have sensed that where there is a departure from the Bible, where the Bible's no longer central, you really get a kind of instinctive decision by people, well, then why should I be involved? What's the point of attending this church where they may have nice talks about certain sociological things or about certain educational things or about psychology or about family relations or whatever, but if there's not really something supernatural here, if it's all just really humans coming up with the best pooling of their wisdom, do I need that? Is that going to do anything for me? Or is it going to do something maybe temporal, but certainly not eternal? So you can see that it really does happen. I was telling David and Beth Collum today about a church I pastored where I went there as an interim pastor a number of years ago. And after being there for several weeks, after the service, the organist said to me, you know, Dr. Stewart, you seem to preach from the Bible pretty much every week. So I said to her, well, yes, that's true, I do. How do you like it? I said. She said, I like it, it's different. Now that was a church that was dying. I went to that church and they were desperate. They really were in serious trouble. There were just a very small number of people coming. They were not financially able to keep even the building repaired and so on, as can happen. You know that can happen. And when I left, a couple of years later, the choir sang me a song titled "Douglas Saved Our Church." I didn't save their church. Their willingness to listen to what the Bible tells them from God saved their church. Their willingness to hear God's truth. And He's put it in the Bible. He's put it in black and white. So we talk about the Bible, not because it's more important than God, but because it is God's love letter to us. It's His loving roadmap for us. Their willingness to do that really turned them around. And then, by God's grace, they insisted that they would get as their next pastor somebody who did preach the Bible pretty much every week. Novel though that had become for them. And they did, and that church has grown and is stable and strong. And it's fun to see that happen. Some of you who are clergy, you've done that. You've gone into parishes and you really have been part of the rescue. You know God did it. You know prayer did it. You know your humility and subjection before him did it. You didn't really do it yourself. But God is a great delegator and great at taking the flimsy bits and pieces of work that we do and magnifying them. You want to lead a Bible study or teach a Sunday school class and you say, oh, gee, I don't know half the stuff. What if somebody asks me, who was the father of the sons of Zebedee? What'll I say? You know, just, I can't answer stuff like that. Those are way beyond my ability. The fact is, the little bit you can figure out each week, and the little bit you can teach to people, and the little bit you can tell them you've learned, and so on, might just be plenty when God adds to it what His Spirit can do to anybody's brain. You know, brain change takes place all the time. Every time I say a sentence and you listen to it, your brain changes, at least temporarily. Every note you take is a reflection of brain change. Everything you learn, your brain changes. So brain change is constant. But God does that. God's Holy Spirit knows how to affect brain change. He's good at it. He's done it for years. And so the Holy Spirit takes the little bits that we faithfully try with all our imperfections to put across. So let me just encourage you, you can be a real change agent if the Bible is at the center of what you have, because that's God's stuff. You are the messenger bringing it, but it's God and authority that makes a difference. Interestingly then, as you see from the slides, here's a denomination that you aren't, most of you. So I picked a neutral denomination, PCUSA. But you know, they really have declined horrendously, more than by half in the last 50 years. And it's sad to see. But it has you can trace the direct correlation of that and certain things done in that denomination. I could put up any number of denominations here. I just picked that one not because I'm anti-Presbyterian, though what do they know? No, I'm not kidding. I'm really not anti-Presbyterian in any way. But I just thought it was a useful statistic, and it's one that's been very carefully documented. Not all denominations are that way. But there's also a big resurgence. If a church, no matter how long it's been in existence, no matter how non-biblical it may have been, if any individual church starts really centering on the Bible, things begin to happen. And part of it is just human nature. You know, you can explain it partly just from a totally human point of view. People want something that's eternal, not just this worldly. People want something that's more than mere human wisdom. And if you have something that you claim is from God, that's huge. There'll be enough, not everybody will listen obviously, but there'll be enough people who will say, all right, I'll listen. You got stuff from God? All right, tell me more. And if you can portray it to them just patiently and as honestly as you can with all your limitations, you'd be surprised. And interestingly, there's a resurgence of younger people in church attendance in this country, but you aren't going to notice it if you aren't in a Bible teaching church. That's because that's where it won't be. They're not going to waste their time with a bunch of older adults being friendly and doing a very nice job of the coffee hour. That's not going to attract the people in that. And I would like to also point to your attention a book that you might enjoy. I mentioned the book in the handout. It's there. The information is all there. But I think you might enjoy reading it. Bradley Wright's a prof at Connecticut, and he wrote a book which I think has a great title. Christians are hate-filled hypocrites and other lies you've been told. And it's a very recent book, as you can see. He tells you from very careful research, people who take the Bible seriously. Now, he uses the term evangelicals. That's a broad term. You don't have to call yourself an evangelical to take the Bible seriously. So it's not the terminology that counts. That's just a convenience. He also points out that the usual stuff that the media tells us is that Christians don't have any better marriages than anybody else. And he said, no, it's not true. By the way, this may be of interest. Sometimes, if you mention sex, you get people's attention. Just checking, looking around. There was a very careful study done some years ago about satisfaction in sex. And it found that the least satisfied people were the ones who were hyper-promiscuous, always out having sex, changing partners, hooking up different nights and so on. They were never happy. They're always looking for something that they didn't find. And you know who the most happy people, they reported that this is not just that they were happy in life, but they had the happiest sex life, were long married, older adults who had been married to the same partner and were deeply religious. Protestants and Catholics, old-fashioned, with the old-fashioned values, they reported the happiest sex life, the most fun. So my recommendation is go back in time and start over. No, I'm just kidding. But that really is true. It's just, now, that doesn't make the Bible true. You know that. But it is just a little incentivizing the fact that this is practical. It affects us even now. It isn't just that we get in on target with God and head for heaven, but it affects our life. Wright mentions that the total percentage of young people is not declining. We may see it in some churches, but the total percentage is not. But they're going to go where they hear somebody saying, we've got divine information this morning. That's where they're going to show up. And of course, all Christians are poor, uneducated Southern whites, we say here in New York. Do Christians think and do Christian things? He has a chapter title, and they do. It does make a difference. Do Christians love others? He can demonstrate why it's so, and then he's got various technical analyses demonstrating the true sophistication of his study. You might like that book. Some of you would say, now this is telling me something. This is telling me there's a practical result to believing the Bible. And I think that's important. We want practical results. It's not that we say the practical results automatically prove everything, but they have a power. Now, science in the Bible interests me, and I think it's important to appreciate the fact that science isn't fixed. We call gas and oil and coal fossil fuels. But there are numbers of scientists, and I'm just going to talk over this slide, and you can look at it as you wish. I give some of the data from the journal in Nature. Just last year, now numbers of scientists saying, no, that's not produced by fossils. That's produced generally in the universe. And you can mine potentially coal and natural gas and oil on Venus or Mars or other places or distant galaxies. Now, of course, we all know that because we watched the movie Alien. And so we know that's a mining ship coming back from a distant planet where they're mining. But they say that's what it is. Now, that's a radical change. I grew up learning they were fossil fuels. That's where they come from. Little dead animals many years ago got oily or gassy, or both. But no, not necessarily so. And so here's a little summary. Now reason to believe that hydrocarbon in significant amounts is in the deep planetary structures of the Earth. Wow! That's a whole different ball game. Quite a thing. Or this month, September, the month of September, this month, there are a whole bunch of papers published, and you may have heard about this, 440 scientists collaborating around the world on the genome. And now, remember what was thought to be junk DNA? Only 10% of the genome has any value. The rest is all vestigial. Oh, no. Not at all. Now, suddenly, it's at least 90% of the former junk, so about 90% of the whole is suddenly understood. It's the controller DNA, the switching DNA. It's not the motor quite. The regular genes really turn out the stuff that needs to happen, control the protein manufacture and all that. But it turns out that the previous junk DNA, dark DNA, useless DNA, vestigial DNA, now all of a sudden that are the geniuses who decide when to turn the machines on and off, and which machines to turn on at the same time, and which machines to turn on for how long, and all of that. Now suddenly that's really clear. So the question is always, when it's science in the Bible, whose science? Last year's science or this year's science? August science or September science? Because now, a few weeks into September, suddenly, it's all significant. Now we get it. And now we can see why certain diseases come from genes. This is the part so this is the area, this former junk stuff, that's really important. Let me also give you a quote from Francis Collins. He was the director of the original Genome Project, the guy who headed it all up, still a brilliant and very powerfully contributing geneticist. He came to faith in Christ reading C.S. Lewis. As I recall, wasn't C.S. Lewis an Episcopalian? Yes, I think that's right. But here's what he says. I'm a scientist and a believer. I don't see any conflict. I'm director of the Human Genome Project. I've led a consortium of scientists to read out billions of letters in the genome. But I know what that is. That's God's language. It's the elegant complexity of our bodies reflected in God's plan. There are so many things we could say about Genesis 1 and other things. This is not what the seminar is. Today is not a seminar on science and the Bible, but I've slipped some in. I did want you to have a chance to at least see that much information, those samples, that perspective, so that we don't get mixed up. Now I want to start with something. We aren't going to finish this. We're going to be able to get a start. And this is some problem passages. I want to start with a problem passage, because I would like, among many other things that we've trying to accomplish all at once today, I'd like us to have some fun together thinking about things that the Bible says that may seem weird. There are plenty of things that can seem weird. We are, after all, people who come at any piece of information with only some perspective and some data, and so lots of things strike us as funny. They don't seem easy to understand automatically. So the main purpose of this is demonstrate the need to understand context, which is a very broad term for all kinds of things related to method, for the things we say in the book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. That's about context. What is the genre that the material is found in, and how does that give you a big start on figuring out the meaning? Context. But it's not limited just to genre considerations. So here's a thing that you might find interesting. The Bible says in 3 different places, these are all found in the law, all found in Exodus and Deuteronomy, do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. So if you want to, turn to Exodus 23:19. And I'd like, if you have your Bibles, if you don't, that's okay. You haven't memorized and you didn't need to bring one. And I'm glad, that's fine with that. No problem. But here's 23:19. You're reading along a bunch of laws. Celebrate the feast this way, and 3 times a year do this, and don't offer the blood of the sacrifice, blah, 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 and the fat must not be kept till morning. And all of a sudden, bring the best of the first fruits to the Lord, and then it ends with, do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. Huh? What? What's wrong with that? But you know, in Judaism, this is huge. Some of you may know that Jews are very, very careful if they're going to have dairy at a meal, such as perhaps for breakfast, a little milk with your cereal or something, no meat. So they always separate meat from milk. Big in Judaism. It's huge. A practicing, observant Jew has done that all his or her life. Always separate out. When you're in Israel and you eat at one of the restaurants, you'll notice that if they've got dairy, they don't have meat. If they have meat, they don't have dairy. It's really strict. They're very strong about that, unless it's in one of the resort places for Americans, and then they don't care if you get poisoned and die. No, just they do. They really. I'm just kidding. But you've noticed I like to kid around. Well, I do. And there'll probably be more of that before we're out today. So what in the world have we got this? And in Judaism, they notice what makes common sense. It's 3 times in the law. You know, by one count, there are a total of 613 laws in the Pentateuch. 613. It's actually the longest, biggest by far ancient law code. It's much bigger. It's 3 times as long as Hammurabi's law and so on. Very big. But even then, That's not a lot of commandments. That's nothing like modern law with thousands and thousands of particular individual laws in federal law or any state law. And we talk about this in the book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, the chapter under law, and what that means, why ancient laws are so much shorter, and what that helps us understand about the Bible law, what's going on, what's the nature of that. Anyway, 3 times this law. So out of 613, 3 of them are spent on the issue of cooking goats in their mother's milk. Not just the dairy and milk and meat thing. This is just one law about goats. It doesn't say don't cook a hamster or anything else, but it's a young goat. Why? What's going on? Well, you could look and stare at that law all day long. You could puzzle over it. You could think about it. Your whole Bible study group could be on their knees for weeks about the meaning of that, and you still wouldn't necessarily come up with it. It's not an easy thing to figure out. Until such time as, and did I actually put anything here? I don't know what I got. Yeah, okay, it looks like nonsense, but it turns out the Canaanites did this. That's where we start to see something. Now that's a context that we can find out by looking at Canaanite religious practices. The very people that the Israelites lived among and whose values and religion were totally anti-Israelite. The Canaanites were super idolatry. God says, that won't save you. That'll distract you away from eternal salvation. I've got a way for you to relate to me as an invisible God, and that's what I want. Now that's just so dramatic. And many other things. Everything about the Canaanites is really absolutely opposed to what God reveals. It's just so opposite. Anyway, the Canaanites did it. Why? What in the world were they doing? Let me just put this down. Yeah, there we go. To the bottom line, because sympathetic magic cannot save from sin. What's sympathetic magic? It's a type of magic that's all over the place in the world. Voodoo from our West Indies in this hemisphere is sympathetic magic. In theory, I ought to be able to make a little doll of our bishop. And if I say the right incantations, I ought to be able to stick a pin in the back of that doll, and he should start, oh man, this hurt. Ooh. That should begin to happen. Even if the doll is crude and so on, but if I've done it right, my incantation's right, that doll captures the essence of that bishop and produces a result in him. That's sympathetic magic. Manipulating something in the real world so that there is a reflection of that somewhere else. Now, here's the deal. Ancient Canaanites believed, as everybody in the ancient world except the Israelites, and then some of them sadly too, they believed in procreation, creation. In other words, things didn't get created, they were all born into existence. So you can read Egyptian myth about creation, read Babylonian, it's all that the earth is born. Everything is born. There's a mother goddess somewhere, or many of them, and they're all giving birth to everything. Well, that's the idea, that's the concept. Everything's born into existence. So magically what you do is you link a mother by its milk and the baby goat as the offspring, and you put them together in a way that symbolizes the birth cycle, and it also turns out to be fine. You can eat it. You can boil meat and eat it, and it's fine. It's a way to have meat. So they would cook it and then eat it. They didn't let it go to waste. They cooked it and eat it. But they had made a motion to stimulate the powers of nature so that other goats would be born and other sheep would be born, and so on and so on and so on. It was a magical practice, a parade example of this kind of thing. And so, in effect, what God is saying to Moses and through Moses to the Israelite people is, just a reminder one more time, those Canaanite practices are not going to lead to your rescue and your forgiveness from sin and your relationship to me. that I want you to have. I want you to become my people and be mine forever and enjoy me forever, because I have a lot of enjoyment to give. Those Canaanite practices will dead end you, but my law will give you the right direction. So once we know some of the details, some of the facts, some of the history, some of the context, suddenly it makes sense. Now that's the first example, and it's time to eat, so by all means, it's far more important to do that than to continue on with any part of the seminar until we've eaten. And I propose that. Does that sound good? Amen. That sounds good. Good, okay. It's a deal.